And welcome to what I hope is the moment that I've been actually thinking about for probably a good 13 years, quite frankly. My name is Patrick Lovell. I'm a television and film producer. I'm an investigative journalist. And I'm the producer of a program called The Con that you can find at www.thecon.tv. I'm about to be joined by two gentlemen that I regard as really superpowers. And I'm just so incredibly humble but grateful that I'm going to have the opportunity to put this conversation together. That's taken some time to put together. But for those of you just seeing this for the first time, you might be asking yourself, well, who am I? Uh, how do I belong in a discussion with Yanis Varoufakis and William K. Black? Well, I'll tell you, I'm nothing special, but I am someone with a very tenacious appetite for truth, and I have always had a fixation of power. I'm a producer, which requires a lot of behind the scenes negotiations with people to put projects together, as well as putting projects together with the people who are the subjects of said production. And I've been a producer for over 2 decades with a front row seat to significant power, which puts me in a situation where I've seen a lot of interactivity with money. But my world got shaken up like tens of millions of people in the aftermath of the great financial crisis. Otherwise, most people might refer to it as the 2008 subprime crisis, but it was a lot more. It was a global contagion. And I was in the midst of asking a lot of questions. Well, at the time, media did not make sense. And as you know, I'm not Russell Brand. I'm not Joe Rogan. I'm not Anderson Cooper. I'm not Rachel Maddow. I'm not Tucker Carlson. And that's a good thing, because the sum total of what's become our media, particularly over the last couple of years, but I think it's in a place now that's absolutely ridiculous, is really a facade to make sure that you don't understand what the two gentlemen that we're going to interact with actually have the answers to. And if somehow we can elevate these revelations above this madness of noise, the sea of turmoil, I think a lot of great things can happen from this. So first, allow me to introduce our two guests. First, Yanis Varoufakis is a longtime economist. He's a incredibly well-known international figure that has been speaking to important scenarios globally for a long time, having actually gone from being a professor working at places like the University of Texas to running for the parliament in Greece in 2015 to becoming the Greek finance minister during the Greek debt crisis. And all of that elucidates, leading to him becoming an author, a wonderful book, anew now. And then, of course, he's also transfixed and transmissioned this information and everything is knowledge base into a paradigmatic political party in Europe known as DiEM25, of which Yanis has just come off another sort of cycle that we learn more every day, although it feels like Groundhog Day. And we'll be joined also by William K. Black, the mentor and my guidance on our project, The Con, who is probably best known for his extraordinary movement within being the general counsel of the Office of Thrift Supervision in San Francisco during the savings and loan crisis, at which time he had put together, on behalf of the government, working with the likes of Ed Gray, 30,000 criminal referrals and over 1,000 convictions for a white-collar crime syndicate that basically was 1/180th the size of what took place in the 2008 great financial crisis. And we've been living with a continuation of everything that's taking place in 2008 that has never fully been understood by the masses or resolved. And so on that note, I'd like to ask you first, Yanis, with that long ramp up, that it's just really cool to see you here. You come from the land, you hail from the land of the demos and democracy. And a big question or point of contention in the United States right now, particularly in our media, is the idea that, well, if Donald Trump isn't held accountable, then that's the end of our democracy. What might you be able to reveal to us about the state of democracy in context to your incredible journey?
The standard narrative that Trump is a threat to democracy is based on a profound misunderstanding of the United States of America and of the West more generally. And the misunderstanding is this erroneous axiom that we have a democracy, or we had a democracy, then Trump came in and steamrolled over it. To Democrats, capital D Democrats, who argue that Donald Trump should be facing the music and that he should be called upon by the judicial process to answer for his crimes, my response is absolutely. But what about the previous presidents? Because every single administration, since time immemorial, has acted in a manner that can only be described as criminal, both within the United States and outside the United States. And that don't take this as a anti-American point of view, because I would say the same thing about my own governments and my own prime ministers and presidents. And I would say the same thing about France, about the Federal Republic of Germany, the United Kingdom, of course, Putin and Russia. Unfortunately, everywhere you look, there is a dearth of democracy. You see different varieties of democracy-free zones. But since I'm, Patrick, in your company, and of course, Bill's company, I think the particular angle from which we have a duty to look at the question of democracy is the banking sector, is the financial sector, and the manner in which complexity, the computer, and the capacity of private bankers to create money, private money out of thin air, are combined in a tsunami of authoritarianism, which demolishes whatever institutions of democracy we have left.
And a follow-up question to that, Yanis, and I'm going to ask you too, Bill. It's a compound question and it's a complex, but I'm just looking for kind of a quick overview to really set the tone of what I think both of you can bring, and hopefully we'll fill in the blanks of. But just the standardized basics. If you could just comment on the fusion of the notion of the definition and the principle of democracy within context to the same for the law, within the same context of the economy, and then if you could just kind of summarize it with your notion of fraud or your definition of fraud in context of the whole. First to you, Yanis.
Well, it's really very simple. I remain wedded to Aristotle's definition of democracy. Remember, Aristotle hated democracy. He was an aristocrat who thought that the riffraff should not rule, the demos should not rule. But he was honest. He was an anti-democrat. But he defined democracy in the most fruitful and useful way. He said democracy is a system of government where the poor have the power, because by definition, the poor are the majority. And democracy is about the power of the majority. Fraud is all about making sure that the poor, or poverty more generally, authorizes wealth, the few, the oligarchs, that's what the oligarchs say, the oligi, the few, to rule over them. Full stop.
Well, and that brings a great segue to obviously Bill, who I consider, the guy who's been bringing these truths for a long time. But both of you will not appear on all of the aforementioned programs that I had mentioned to reveal these truths that we're going to delve into. But Bill, the one thing that Yanis didn't mention was the law. Can you kind of answer the question between the premise of democracy, the law, obviously economics, but ultimately fraud?
Sure. So the assumption, if you're an American, is if the law is involved, well, then things are good. Right? But the famous saying of, a particular one of those aristocrats that Yanis was talking about was, for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law. Right? So the law can be used to help or harm both commerce and democracy and just plain what we call human rights. So Bastiat, a sort of very conservative French economist, also put it together. He said, when plunder becomes a way of life for people in high society, they create a law that authorizes the plunder, and they create a moral code that glorifies it. And I think this is what Yanis was quite correctly getting at in large part. So, to just by way of background, I'm on my third career. My first career was as a lawyer. My second career was as a financial regulator. And then third career was an academic, beginning at one of the same institutions Yanis has famously served, the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And my primary appointment academically is in economics, joint in law, but I'm really a white-collar criminologist. And to build on what you were talking about, we produced over 1,700 felony convictions in the savings and loan crisis. And those were hyper-prioritized against the most elite individuals, because that's where the really destructive frauds come. And I'll just pick up on one of Yanis's key points. I'm also a serial whistleblower. I blew the whistle on 5 U.S. senators who became known as the Keating Five. I blew the whistle on the Speaker of the House of the United States, Jim Wright. And the Speaker of the House is the answer to the trick question: who's the second most powerful elected official in America? It's not the Vice President, it's the Speaker of the House. The head of my agency and another presidential appointee running my agency. Of those 6 super prominent elected officials I blew the whistle on, 5 of them were Democrats. I'm a Democrat. But we unhesitatingly made criminal referrals on those people, and we never made the mistake of believing that one party was the good party, right? The elite criminals always know that the highest return on assets is a political contribution. And both parties frequently serve, not always, but most frequently serve the interests of the most elite criminals. And they're criminals because fraud is a sure thing. And these people sell themselves as if they're big risk takers, but they hate risk. They want to rig the system.
Well, on that note, though, and again, so for me, one of my come froms, my area of study, look, I'm not a PhD. I'm not a world-renowned economist. I don't have a law degree. I studied political science. I've always had a great...
Stop bragging, Patrick.
I've always had a great interest in power, but particularly, history, of which has dramatized, suffering at monumental levels, right? Hitler, the Third Reich. And then from that, you understand a lot of what happened in the Soviet Union. And I bring this back to you, Yanis, because you typically shock a lot of people who think that you are coming from one specific arena and that are going to kind of glean, sort of interpretation of the way the world is based on what everybody's perception was based on whatever they're come from. Socialism, capitalism, so on and so forth. But what you tend to do, what I've always found incredibly relevant and important, particularly to what Bill has taught us through our work, is ultimately this sort of perverse inversion with all sorts of tricks and mechanics that turn the idea of socialism inside out and also pervert any notion of democracy, for example. Can you, it's a long roadmap for what you've experienced throughout your career, Yanis, and what you've been attempting to do. But really, socialism is something that you tend to reveal to us. Let me reconfigure this. Capitalism is not what we think it is, nor is socialism. Can you comment on that?
Well, I will side with Bill when he asked you to stop bragging, when you said that you have not been trained in political science or economic science. You should consider this a great badge of honor and also a great help in understanding the world we live in. Because unlike physics, engineering, chemistry, and so on, which are indispensable if you want to understand how nature works, not having been trained in formal political science or economic science is actually a great boon, a great help in understanding capitalism. Because let me put it this way, really existing capitalism has as much to do with the theory of free market liberal capitalism, which is taught at the best schools around the world, in the United States and outside, as Marxism had to do with the Soviet Union. In other words, no connection whatsoever. Completely and utterly irrelevant. Really existing capitalism does not exist in the economic theories which are being used in order to justify capitalism. I always knew that. I always knew that as a student, PhD student, as an academic, but I had to go through the experience of being a finance minister of the most bankrupt country, the equivalent of the United States subprime market. That's what Greece was after 2009, 2010, when we went bankrupt. I had to actually experience how the system works to know that what we had was orchestrated, scientifically composed plunder, to use again Bill Black's reference to Bastiat. This was sophisticated, computerized, highly polished plunder and nothing else. So, and allow me, because most of our audience comes from the United States. So Bill Black has been amongst very few people who have contributed to exposing what went on in Wall Street, what Hank Paulson did, what Larry Summers did, what Tim Geithner did in order to cover it up and to create the revolving doors between the plunder coming from Wall Street and the plunder coming from Washington, D.C. Allow me to expose a mainly United States American audience to what happened here. And this time by our European Union, highly polished, very civilized, bourgeois, liberal democratic apparatchik. So here it goes, just to give you a whiff of what I experienced, right? After the catastrophe in Wall Street that you, Patrick, and of course you, Bill, know better than anyone, a few months later, here in Europe, prime ministers and chancellors like Angela Merkel realized that the German and French banks were more exposed to American toxic derivatives, weapons of mass financial destruction, as Warren Buffett put it, than American banks were. So they started toppling one after the other, and we had the Euro crisis. From the perspective of Greece, which you Americans should think of as the US subprime market, right? The poorest of the debtors who have been played on by big sharks in order to create derivative trades across the city of London, Frankfurt, Paris, and so on. So here it goes, right? So before the crisis, before 2008, during the 2000s, Deutsche Bank, you will use Deutsche Bank, the largest German bank, as paradigmatic. It can be Finanzbank, it could be Société Générale from France, but think of Deutsche Bank. It lends simultaneously the Greek state and the Greek private banks. It lends the Greek state so as the Greek state can afford to purchase overinflated services and goods from German conglomerates like Siemens. So this is on the one hand. And on the other hand, at the same time, Deutsche Bank is lending billions to the Greek private banks to pass them on as personal loans to Greek consumers, Greek citizens, to buy Volkswagens and Mercedes-Benzes. So this is vendor financing. This is standard, nothing special here. What happens is that once liquidity dries up after 2008, beginning in Wall Street, Deutsche Bank is bankrupt, and Angela Merkel is forced to bail it out with a sum exceeding TARP. It was 600 billion euros, which was more than the money that Hank Paulson set aside for TARP, or thereabouts. But it wasn't enough. 4 months later, she was told that the Greek state is going bankrupt, which means the Greek banks will go bankrupt, which means that she needs to pump another 600 billion euros, $750 billion to the same banks, to the same German banks. And she goes, absolutely, masses, I can't do this. So the Greek bailout begins, which is not a bailout for Greece, it's a bailout for Deutsche Bank. And here's how they do it, because it's very intricate, very, complexity gone mad. So here's what they do. They save the Greek banks, not with direct infusion of cash, not at first. They allowed the Greek banks to write IOUs to the tune of dollars, let's put it in terms of dollars, $80 billion. That's a lot for a small economy with not even 200 billion of GDP. Right? So they allowed them to issue worthless IOUs. These are bankrupt banks. So you have a bankrupt bank being allowed to issue IOUs. To give it supposedly value to these IOUs, to give them value, the Greek state, which is of course bankrupt, is guaranteeing those. So the bankrupt Greek state guarantees the bankrupt private bankers' IOUs. Why? Why would you ever buy a piece of paper issued by a bankrupt entity and guaranteed by another bankrupt entity? No. But this was part of the shenanigan, because the idea was to give the right to the Greek banks to deposit those guaranteed by the Greek bankrupt government IOUs to the European Central Bank in Frankfurt as collateral for liquidity. Liquidity to do what? To repay Deutsche Bank. Meanwhile, the Greek state is bailed out by the largest loan in the history of the world. Not in relative terms, relative to Greece's puny GDP, but in absolute terms. There has never been a larger loan in the history of the world than what was given to the Greek state. None of it was retained by the Greek state. It was all given to Deutsche Bank in order to make it not whole. It was impossible to make it whole because Deutsche Bank and the likes of Deutsche Bank had bet so much in the American subprime market. It was impossible to make it whole, even by this huge bailout, right? Okay, and here comes my own personal experience, which I think Bill will enjoy. Sometime in April of 2015, I am the finance minister, a radical left-wing finance minister who was elected, not because the Greeks became radical leftists, but because they had tried all the others and then they tried us as well. And I was negotiating with the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission that was representing the German bankers. And they were denying us all liquidity in order effectively to overthrow us. It was a kind of coup d'etat. And it was actually quite amusing because I was saying to them, listen, you are telling me that next month I need, actually not next month, 2 months from then, from that moment, I need to pay the European Central Bank 5 billion euros as an installment for some of the loans that were given to the Greek state to give to Deutsche Bank. Now, I don't have that $5 billion. You know I don't have it. I can scrape the bottom of the barrel, but I don't have it. So let's say that I agree with you, whatever it is that you're saying. How am I going to make this repayment? I don't. I know you know that I know that this money doesn't exist. And here is what they proposed. I'm not kidding you. What I'm going to tell you now is what they actually proposed. They proposed the following. For this small payment, a relative small payment of 5 billion to the central bank, to our central bank, here's what you'll do. The Greek bankrupt banks will be allowed to issue another 7 billion euros of IOUs. You will guarantee them, right? You will guarantee them. Then they will take those 7 billion worthless IOUs guaranteed by you, the finance minister of the most bankrupt state in the world. They will take it to the ECB. The ECB is going to give them, on the basis of this collateral of 7 billion, they will give them the 5 billion, right? Then you will issue treasury bills worth 5 billion, and they will buy them from you, right? And you will use this money to give it to their central bank. I kid you not, that was their solution to the problem. And why are they doing this? Why did they, at the same time, lend my predecessor, the finance minister, another 50 billion to give to the Greek banks, knowing that the Greek banks were full of non-performing loans, and it would be like, pouring money or liquidity into a sieve. It would, that the holes in the sieve are represented by the non-performing loans. Right? The only reason why they were doing all that was to ensure that the public out there didn't know that the Greek state, the Greek banks, and Deutsche Bank were bankrupt. Number one. Number two, that no politician who had been bribed by Siemens to borrow money from Deutsche Bank in the first place would be prosecuted. To ensure that no banker loses their power over their bank. And finally, to create a new market, which after my resignation, due to the fact that I was refusing to sign on the dotted line of that remarkable fraud, my replacement in the finance minister signed every piece of paper they gave him. And the result is they created now a secondary market in non-performing loans, which is leading to the massive eviction of up to 40% of Greek households, and the creation of a secondary market of non-performing loans, which are being turbocharged in terms of their market value through quantitative easing of the European Central Bank. And those non-performing loans, whose value has been turbocharged by the QE of the ECB, are being deposited by the banks that now have been sold to people like John Paulson, yes, the criminal John Paulson, who owns the largest Greek bank, deposited in the ECB as collateral. This is what's happening this very moment. I'm sorry for having taken so long, but for our American audience, I wanted you to know that what's happening in Greece matters, because it is an extension of what was going on in Wall Street. And criminals like John Paulson are managing to escape certain constraints placed upon them in the United States, in Washington, D.C., because this time, unlike the savings and loans situation, people like John Paulson got away with it. They're managing to escape by expanding their tentacles and stretching them to the banking system of my little puny country.
If you don't mind me inserting this real quick, I mean, that was really something. And Bill, I'm going to turn this to you because there's a lot I can imagine you could go with. But I just want for the viewer to understand a few things about John Paulson. John Paulson ran a hedge fund that is most associated with the real Big Short. Now, in terms of sort of commercial iconic, revelation in pop culture in the United States, we had a film called The Big Short that was produced by Brad Pitt's company, starring Christian Bale. Fantastic performances. It's all built on Michael Burry's hedge fund that shorted the market. Short story. Did their homework supposedly, and they made out with a short of about $498 million. And this was because they supposedly understood what the market wasn't seeing. They did their research. They knew that there was subprime that moved into ninja loans, that moved into liar's loans, and all sorts of other variances. But the real Big Short that they didn't touch was a gentleman by the name of John Paulson. Now, John Paulson, with his lieutenant, a gentleman by the name of Paolo Pellegrini, we had learned in our aggregation of a lot of information, much of which, unfortunately, I have on the sidelines right now in our drives because we can't find a commercial market for this product yet because of the nature of what we're revealing here. But John Paulson and Paolo Pellegrini handpicked all of the worst liar's loans that were created by these vectors of these former, felony guys out of that were brokers in places like Florida and Seattle, among others, but that they plugged into, thanks to Bill, who got us this information, an outfit called Greenpoint that Goldman Sachs actually incorporated as a vertical. And all of the major banks in the United States did this countrywide, Bank of America did it with Countrywide. But what they did was they picked the worst of the worst loans to fail that they then vectored all around the world through, countries like Greece, as we're hearing here. But I knew that, but we're hearing downstream all of the unbelievable effects that were almost, it sounds to me, mirrored of what we saw in the United States. And ultimately, what John Paulson had walked with, which was the greatest trade ever, was $20 billion from the collapse of the 2008 great financial crisis by them being, through intent, destroying the world with the Big Short that they blew up the world with. These were weapons of mass destruction, right? So, Bill, a lot to cover here, but the first thing that I found very fascinating with what Yanis had revealed is that they were sort of a target of predation by the system and the derivatives after the fact, after what you have revealed to us throughout your years of understanding control fraud and ultimately its predation on targeting the most vulnerable amongst us. For example, in our work, The Con, we started with the story of a woman by the name of Addie Polk. I wonder if you could fill in the blanks from control fraud and predation to what Yanis just revealed to us.
Okay, so everything Yanis was talking about is control fraud, and control fraud is simply what happens when people who control either firms or government units use that seemingly legitimate entity as camouflage, a weapon, and a shield simultaneously. And Yanis just described all of those usages. So let me pick up on your thing about the real Big Short. So it's, of course, quite an irony that a book and a movie about the Big Short didn't talk about either of the two biggest shorts, right? Because the two biggest shorts were related. One was Goldman Sachs and the other was Paulson. By the way, no relationship to the Treasury Secretary in the United States, right? And so they worked together to dump on unsuspecting clients, right? Customers, the worst of the worst stuff. And Goldman Sachs, in internal documents at the most senior levels, referred to it as, and I quote, the Big Short. So you might have thought that would have been the basis for the movie, but of course, it's not even mentioned. It's like these are, two quirky guys, little folks who have this immense discovery. So what did Yanis tell you about? Well, for brevity, it may have seemed, long, but Yanis is really trying to compress this stuff for an American audience. Goldman Sachs appears again in the Greece story, right? And Goldman Sachs first does this scam to make it look like Greece is compliant with these requisite things in the European EU for joining the fiscal unit, right? So that scam begins. Seaman is a massively fraudulent entity, right? That was caught doing bribes all over the world. Deutsche Bank, if we just in a normal tone listed its acts of major predation and fraud, it would take us 40 minutes. So this is a serial disaster that he's describing. But as an example, right? Remember, finance. It's supposed to be all about risk and taking highly risky positions. It's supposed to, if you're competent, lead to really big returns. Well, that's not how you do it because, as I said, they hate risk. So what they did is get together with all the other major banks in two massive scams involving financial derivatives, and they fixed it. And they then paid a bonus to the guys who scammed the system of over $100 million, 100 million euros. And the internal memos at Deutsche Bank says it's because they make us a mountain of money and they make it in all kinds of markets, up markets, down markets. Well, wait a minute. How do they do that? How do they always win? They always win because they cheat. So Yanis is absolutely right. For a full decade before the great financial crisis, Europe was eager to adopt what was called Basel II because it weakened the capital standards. So even though the great financial crisis losses originally were originated overwhelmingly in the United States, the big European banks, most especially the fraudulent ones like Deutsche Bank, massively disproportionately bought the crap, right? So when Goldman Sachs and Paulson were looking for the fool in the market, they said Deutsche Bank and places like that. And that's part of the reason that Europe suffered so badly in the great financial crisis. Now, super briefly in the United States, when the head of the Federal Regulatory Agency went rogue, he was a Reagan appointee who hated regulation, but he had this road to Damascus experience, and he came up and sought to re-regulate and introduced a regulation. All right. A majority of the House of Representatives, including the entire leadership structure of the Republican and Democratic parties, got together to co-sponsor a resolution calling on the head of the agency to cease doing so. The Reagan administration threatened to bring a criminal prosecution against Ed Gray on the grounds that he was closing too many insolvent thrifts. During the entirety of his time as head of the agency, where he is desperately going to Congress and saying, we have a catastrophe, give us these enhanced powers, they gave him zero, not nearly zero, zero enhanced powers. Instead, they passed a statute trying to gut our enforcement powers. Now go forward in time. Despite all of this, we get these record convictions. Imagine 1,700 elite, successful convictions of fraud schemes based on complicated accounting of the kind that Yanis has illustrated, except actually more complicated, right? What did they do? Well, the Clinton-Gore administration, Democrats, cut the FDIC staff by more than 3/4. They cut the thrift regulators by more than half. And they eliminated the criminal referral units. Remember, we made over 30,000 criminal referrals just as the little savings and loan agency. And as a result, when you get to the great financial crisis, there is no more capacity and no more willingness in anybody in regulatory leadership appointed by either the Clinton or the Bush administration to do, or the Obama administration. It isn't that they failed in their prosecutions. They brought no prosecutions of any elite banker that drove the great financial crisis, even though the fraud and predation schemes were identical to those used in the third act of the savings and loan debacle.
And Yanis, that's, ultimately what was the causality for my never-ending odyssey that now feels like Groundhog Day, because I believed once that the law had worked. I believed that the adults could figure out these problems in the context of what I thought at the time was bedrock principle of a government of, by, and for the people that operated with the integrity of law. But as you're both demonstrating, that it's the corruption of the system that has created this reality that we're both in the midst of. I want to do a quick follow-up with Bill here, just to set you up for a follow-up to really the purpose of this dialogue. Because Bill, the predation again, though, if you could please describe control fraud as it relates to what Yanis constantly refers to as the little people, in this sort of grand scenario that gets us to this global sort of. It's not sort of. It's a pipeline of fraud. It's the emperor's new clothes. It's a facade. It's everything we talked about at the outset is not real. The law, the integrity of the law, because of the deregulation, decriminalization, and the supervision, but ultimately through these vectors that create this contagion around the world that could have catastrophic consequences. So what are the American people, because our media doesn't understand this stuff, missing by way of CEO control fraud, how it targets the little people, and then ultimately how it becomes this vector through Gresham's dynamic and other elements that has become what we can't seem to get out of the way of?
Okay, this takes a little bit of time. All right. So there isn't that much difference between fraud and predation. This is the Bastiat point, right? if I define the law such that predating on poor people isn't a crime, well, then it ain't a crime, right? And I can't prosecute it, but it is still predatory. So first, we've been talking about money to this point, right? Although Yanis quite appropriately started to bring in the plight of Greek homeowners who are, losing their homes in massive amounts. But control fraud and predation is the leading cause of preventable death in the world. What do I mean? Things like smoking, right? That is a leading killer. Things like putting lead in gasoline. These are leading killers, right? So don't think it's just money. It is in many ways the thing that kills people. And that's even before we get into more complicated things, I hope, in future talks about this relationship to global poverty and such. So what's different when the CEO of a seemingly legitimate entity is a crook? He will use his firm, right? So first, everything Yanis quite appropriately talking about, those are various forms of accounting scams. So you hire the most prestigious accounting firms in the world. Now, if you're trained as a conventional economist, you'd say, oh, that's great. They have a reputational interest. Everything will be well. Well, everything Yanis described, everything I described was blessed by the top accounting firms in the world because it's easy. They want to become partners, right? That's where your big money and power comes in a major audit firm. And you just need one partner, right? So they're able to find them. Patrick referred to the Gresham's dynamic. This is an economic. It was defined by a Nobel laureate in economics, George Akerlof, in one of the most famous articles in all of economics. And Gresham's dynamic is if you gain a competitive advantage by cheating, then the cheaters will tend to drive the honest people out of the markets because they gain a competitive advantage. So what's our job as regulators, as prosecutors? To prevent a Gresham's dynamic. Instead, for the reasons Yanis and I have explained, we actually have government helping to create Gresham's dynamics in these cases. All right, what else we're going to do? We're going to, if we're in the private sector as a CEO and we want to be crooks, we're going to enlist public sector help. In the United States context, a $50,000 contribution will put you on a first name basis with virtually every senator in America. Well, that's 50 million bucks. For a corporation, that's nothing. So as the CEO, I can have the corporation give raises, $50,000 raises, to a bunch of my officers. And then they all write checks. And then it's in the US, it's called bundling. The CEO takes all the checks, the 50 million, and distributes it to make sure that he gets credit for that. In the savings and loan debacle, my saying was the highest return on assets is always a political contribution. But what else do? You recruit the media. So in the US context and, Australia and UK and such, the Murdochs of the world and such. And so now you have an organ that lies about everything and attacks your foes. Or maybe you do even a sleazy rag and it buys the rights of someone who has been in an affair with a Donald Trump, and it kills the story, right? So it's incredibly valuable to have various organs of power in government, in the private sector, and all of these can be done through chump change. Now, to Patrick's point on predation, here's how it worked in the United States context. It's just one example, right? So I would love to make a lot of money by loaning to poor people at exceptionally high interest rates. How could I do that? Well, I get an army of loan brokers. They're agents, not employees. They only get paid by me, the lender, if the loan gets approved. Well, what are they going to do to get the loan approved? They're going to extort appraisers, which is exactly what they did, to inflate the appraised value of the home. And they created a Gresham's dynamic. It's in the National Report on the Causes of the Debacle, in which dishonest appraisers drove honest appraisers largely out of the marketplace. And I only need one who gives me my inflated value, right? What else would get the loan looking as if it were safe? What if I inflated the borrower's income massively? And the industry, the real estate industry's own fraud experts, found that the incidence of fraud in inflating borrowers' income was 90%, and that more than 50% of the cases they inflated, more than 60% of the cases they inflated the borrower's income by at least 50%. Right? Now, the borrower is unsophisticated, has no idea what the magic numbers are to hit in terms of the appraisal value, in terms of the inflated income. But the loan broker is provided by the lender with a term sheet each day that says, here's where the magic number is. So gosh and darn, they inflate the income above that. And then the whipped cream on the top of this incredible dessert, the bank would tell the loan broker, we are willing to make this loan at 8%. However, if you can con your borrower into paying 8.5% or 9.5%, we will pay you something called a yield spread premium. And collectively, those yield spread premiums provided more income than all of the regular stuff. And that one is just pure predation. How can I con my borrower into doing something bad for him? Because he gets absolutely nothing positive from paying a higher interest rate. And at that point, it's who does the loan broker think is the most vulnerable to being conned? And their answer was the elderly, Blacks, and Latinos, whose primary language is Spanish. Because big banks in America, they ain't in the poor areas. But loan brokers are little storefront offices everywhere in which the very helpful loan broker who is fluent in Spanish, if that's what your primary language, goes and talks to you. And all the discussions are in Spanish until you get to the loan closing where all the documents are in English. And that degree of predation was successful of this yield spread premium, roughly 50% of the cases where they tried to do it. So an amazingly high success rate. And collectively, the lost GDP, the present value of the lost GDP because of the great financial crisis in the United States is estimated by economists at 41.7 trillion. That's with a T. In the United States, a trillion is 1,000 billion. So the losses are staggering, and those losses were hyper concentrated among Blacks and Latinos, such that Latinos lost, with college degrees or more, lost over 60% of their net worth during the period of the great financial crisis, and Blacks over 50%. National averages.
And all of this was to feed the pipeline of modern executive compensation, of which, of course, our CEOs in question here, using the control fraud to fraudulently and deceptively create this pipeline that, as you see in the con, if you go to www.thecon.tv, you'll see the entire stopgap arena of the housing industry that would ultimately blow up the world, including, of course, what Yanis is revealing to us after his extraordinary experience in this whole thing. But I want to bring it back full circle.
Let me just do 15 seconds for Yanis, because I bet you that he has the same experience I did. I was taught by very good economics profs that you don't have to worry about cartels because they sow the seeds of their own destruction because nobody can ever get together. Everything I've described is a win-win. Mm-hmm. They used modern executive compensation to create a win-win, and therefore it isn't a cartel. It is perfectly stable. People eagerly go out like herds of locusts. A place, these large liar's loan lenders had over 50,000 loan brokers working for them. Thank you, sir.
Yanis, I have to apologize because I know we're getting to the end of our prescribed time together, but I want to try to set this up really quick to give you the final word, unless you both decide you want to go further in this. And maybe we could set up another time downstream. But I think I find myself in this extraordinary position because, again, I'm nobody special, but unfortunately I've been on this path for a very long time. And I want to apologize up front that we haven't gotten to techno-feudalism and all the details of what you've been in the midst of vis-a your political paradigm shift by way of trying to get democracy to flourish, given everything that we're talking about. But just 2 points of fact here to give you the last word on this, Yanis. So first and foremost, you mentioned Deutsche Bank. Ironically, through John Paulson and Deutsche Bank and all things Greece, this does bring back the relevance of Trump, incidentally, because Trump, unbeknownst to most people, in 2012, he had sued Deutsche Bank for being a victim of, it was played out in the press as some sort of act of God, but it really wasn't. He sued Deutsche Bank for being a victim of predatory lending. And he was able to stall his impending bankruptcy as a result of this mishegas in what he normally does. So when you consider Donald Trump in this context, and you further what we're seeing today in America's media, particularly 24/7, that everything that we're trying to reveal to you, and there's so much more to the audience, that the mainstream media is not revealing to us, of this incredible hyper-contextualization of engineered fraud that's a global scheme that ultimately in your work, Yanis, in addition to techno-feudalism and everything else, you always bring it back to the central bank. And of course, that the sort of programs, the emergency programs that followed 2008 changed everything. What exactly are we looking at in the rearview mirror as it relates to everything that we're talking about, if you can, obviously in whatever time span we have left, Yanis?
Sure. Let me first answer Bill's point about the resilience of cartels. The reason why Bill said that economic theory misleads students into thinking that cartels are unstable is because cartels are being presented by economics professors as a prisoner's dilemma. You know the prisoner's dilemma, the story, do I confess or not confess? We would both be better off if neither confesses. But if I confess, I'm better off regardless of what the other guy does in the cell next door, okay? And if it is a prisoner's dilemma, then it is truly unstable, but it is not a prisoner's dilemma. What Bill is saying is that there is a single equilibrium, like in the prisoner's dilemma, but it's the opposite. The only equilibrium of the game is collusion, because if you fail to collude and the other guys collude, then you're worse off. If the other guys fail to collude, you're still worse off if you abscond from the cartel's behavior. So it's a stable equilibrium. That I think is Bill's point. Look, you mentioned, Patrick, central banks and their roles into this. Allow me to make the point that you Americans should stop feeling that you are so exceptional, because that is the case both with Americans who are supporting the system in the United States and also radical critics, socialists, whatever, of the system. Radicals in the United States, and my best friends are American radicals, you think that your system is the worst in the world. It's not. You're not even exceptional at that. You're not the worst. The worst is the European Union. You mentioned, Bill, before, how Goldman Sachs got involved here in the European Union, in the south of the Eurozone, of the common currency area, in using its immense skills at misrepresenting the macroeconomic data of Greece, but also of Italy. It started with Italy, and then it went to Greece. But you know what I have to say about this is that I wouldn't blame Goldman Sachs for that, because it was their idea. They didn't one day wake up and think, okay, now how can we manipulate the macroeconomic data of Greece and Italy? No, they were invited to do this. And do you know who they were invited by? By our central banks. That's who invited them. Because the European Union apparatchiks, the decision makers who are not usually elected, they had this project of creating a common currency to end the Italian currency, the lira, and the Greek drachma. Why? Because the constant devaluations of those currencies vis-a-vis the Deutsche Mark, which was a strong currency, made it hard for Volkswagen and Mercedes and Siemens and IG to sell their wares to the Italian and the Greek markets to compete with the Italian and Greek car makers, refrigerator makers, and so on, whose products were becoming slightly more competitive the moment there was a devaluation of the lira or the drachma. So they came up with these strict fiscal rules about which country has the right to enter, and you had to have a budget deficit below a certain level, you had to have a debt to GDP ratio below a certain level, and then once they drew up those rules, which were important for propaganda purposes, to show to the average German, to the average Dutchman or woman that, you know, they don't let any riffraff, you know, the riffraff enter the common currency area at will. Once they had created those rules, they had to bend them in order to let Italy and Greece in, because they needed Italy for the common currency to make any sense in terms of selling German manufactured products to the Italians. So they brought Goldman Sachs in with an explicit request, can you find a way of shrinking the official level of the Greek or the Italian government's budget deficit? Simultaneously, Bill, you mentioned the fact, which is absolutely correct, that the German and the French banks had purchased so many subprime mortgages and CDOs, primarily toxic derivatives, more than, you know, the American banks were producing them, they were also consuming them. But the Deutsche Bank, the Société Générale, the finance banks of Europe bought them as if there was no tomorrow. And they bought them paying dollars, which their central bank could not issue. Not only that, but the European Central Bank was created, its constitution, its charter was such that it could not create money to give to the bankers, unlike the Fed. They could not do what Summers and Geithner did in the famous Geithner-Summers scheme, scam, plan, whatever. Yeah, because that was based on the Fed's capacity and the FDIC's capacity to step in and back up this pseudo market of toxic derivatives that we were trying to refloat. The Europeans couldn't do that. This is why they created such a huge wave of austerity, effectively to rob the little people who were already suffering from the financial collapse in order to bail out Deutsche Bank and so on. So they create, the same people who brought in Goldman Sachs had created the European Central Bank that did not have, by design, the capacity of the Fed to bail out the fraudulent financial sector. And you may ask why, okay, at that point, why did they not give in and recreate the capacities of the Fed in Europe? Why didn't they create a federal budget, which would have been necessary to do that which Hank Paulson did? You know, TARP. The Europeans couldn't do one because they didn't have a federal treasury. Why didn't they actually take the step of creating a federation in order to use it in the same way that the federal government was using its powers in the United States to cover up for the fuck-ups and the fraud of Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan and so on? Well, the answer is because they were far worse than the American government, because they wanted, they chose the lack of a federal treasury so as to prevent a federal social security system. They wanted to prevent all those federal institutions, which are automatic stabilizers, taking some money from the circuits of wealth and money and income and channeling through food stamps, through Social Security, through Medicare to the little people in a manner which stabilizes the federation, the common currency area in Europe. They chose that. They did not want, they preferred to risk the complete destruction of the Eurozone of the European Union and massive poverty, massive increases in poverty, which we have had and we still have, rather than see to it that the federal institutions which could help their bankers will be created. And one last, if you want, smidgen of analysis here to link your predicament with our predicament. Why didn't they want to consolidate the federation, the monetary federation, into a fiscal and political federation? To do that which the United States did, especially after Alexander Hamilton and so on and so forth, with common debts and a proper federal reserve and so on. Well, that is where the United States comes in. Because, you know, there is this long discussion, especially today, as to whether the dollar is risking its exorbitant privilege, whether the Chinese yuan or the euro is going to take over to replace the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Well, let me tell you, the euro will never threaten the dollar. And you know why? Because Dutch, French, Greek, Italian, German capitalists do not want it to. It would be their absolute horror, nightmare, to see the replacement of the dollar. Why? Because the exorbitant privilege of the dollar, which of course makes Wall Street such a significant force in the world of finance, of international finance, the exorbitant privilege of the dollar is based on the American trade deficit, which acts as a vacuum cleaner, sucking up the net exports of the Dutch, of the Germans, and so on, into the United States, at the same time sucking into Wall Street 70% of capitalist profits of the Dutch, Germans, Italians, French capitalists, and so on. So you see, the European Union's institutions have been designed, purposely designed, in such a way as to ensure that the euro would remain a subservient currency to the dollar. The French and German banks would remain subservient to Wall Street. The European Union would always work in a manner that would be against the interests even of the average European capitalist, who is not party to this massive fraud, which is centered upon the world of finance, European and American finance. And they did their utmost during the last 13 years, following the 2008 crisis, of massive crisis, banking crisis, labor market crisis, political crisis in Europe, in order to prevent the consolidation, the federation of the European Union. And in the process, they employed Goldman Sachs, as I said before. And this is where I'm going to leave you with another mention of John Paulson, who, in the midst of all this, a few months after my resignation from the finance ministry, was effectively given the largest bank of Greece, which had already acquired the good part of a public agricultural bank that was for 110 years financing smallholders across Greece, and therefore owned 70% of all arable land, because all the farmers had deposited as collateral the title deeds to the arable land of Greece. And John Paulson, that criminal that you referred to, Patrick, before, now owns 70% of our arable land. This as a small vignette by which to draw the interconnectedness between your catastrophe and ours.
Well, I believe that, I'd like to plant the seed with both of you that I hope that we could turn this into a series, actually, because we barely scratched the surface of what I know you both offer. And yet somehow we have to elevate above the noise of lies. But I do want to ask you both one final closing comment as it relates to this, because Yanis, the reason beyond everything else that I've been drawn to you, and when I listen to you and your explanation of these complex factors in such a way that, I mean, just from my heart to you, man, you sound like one of the greatest guitar players or musicians I've ever heard at being able to filter this. But I always felt what was missing was what hit me the day that I found Bill Black, when I happened to be channel surfing on a fateful Sunday afternoon with a journalist by the name of Bill Moyers, circa, I think it was maybe 2009, where suddenly all of these questions that I had were being served to me on a platinum platter that nobody in media, nobody around the world, not in the New York Times, not anywhere, was demonstrating that Bill Black with all of the demonstration of how the system works. Because, of course, I've been in management. I've seen how power works and things happen. And so you can start to, think, well, somebody's got to make a decision about something. So what are we looking at here? But ultimately, what you have done for me, Yanis, is you tend to always come back to 2008. And as I demonstrated at the very beginning, I mean, we talk about just the very essence of what the demos, democracy, the integrity of law, the ideals of capitalism versus socialism in the context of this crazy gymnastics that you guys have eloquently revealed in this conversation. But it comes down to the emperor's new clothes, because it's the central bank of the United States, through the unbelievable maneuverings that provided tens of trillions of dollars of emergency lending apparatus to bankrupt insolvent banks based on racketeering and fraud that built these pipelines of toxic assets that vectored around the world. And we're still dealing with the aftermath, particularly as it relates to quantitative easing over the course of the last 13 years. So can you give us a closing comment, considering how long we've gone, and then maybe tee up Bill, if you don't mind, based on your perspective of the role of the Federal Reserve, given all of these things that we're revealing?
They're at it as we speak. They have never stopped. They never will stop unless a democratic force, which I can't see in the horizon, is created to actually stop them. Think of what they did with First Republic. Effectively, they gave billions and billions to J.P. Morgan so that J.P. Morgan could become more of a cartel than it already is. This is, the latest thing. I'm sure they're doing something as we speak, which we don't know and will be revealed at some point, probably by Bill Black or somebody of that ilk. They will not cease and desist unless and until we break down this pseudo-democracy of two parties that both represent exactly the same cartel with different colors, in the way that the Byzantine emperors of Constantinople were creating, sort of a propaganda machine at the Hippodrome in Constantinople. They had two teams. They had the red team and the blue team, and they both belonged to the emperor. And they divided the population into supporters of the blue team and the red team in order to rule over them. So, nothing changes when you have autocracies whose loot and wealth and power and even elegance depends on plunder. Only a proper democratic force that goes beyond national borders. It's a very tall order, I know, but some of us are trying. We have the Progressive International that we're trying with. Bernie Sanders and I started that sometime in Vermont in 2018. We need to keep trying. We'll probably fail. I'm sure we will fail, but life is not worth it until we understand that it's all in the struggle, not in the outcome.
Bill, will you please give us closing comments?
Sure. So avoid military metaphors. Can never be, for the reasons Yanis has been explaining, and to some extent me, a decisive victory in which you win and you can go home. This is a struggle for all time that all people have to do. And I would pick up on something Yanis said. United States isn't remotely as bad as a vast range of nations, including, by the way, the People's Republic of China on this. So think of this. In the US context, just in my little orbit that I was able to observe, you have this decades-long friend on a personal basis of Ronald and Nancy Reagan, and that the Nancy part's important, who became convinced by the facts that everything he believed was wrong and by his own description had a road to Damascus conversion to becoming a regulator. You have Joe Selby, who's probably nobody's heard of, who twice rose through the ranks to become the acting head of the Office of the Comptroller of Currency. An incredible thing, but of course would never be appointed as the actual long-term head of any agency because he was so skillful, who accepted the request of Ed Gray to go to the worst spot in America, Texas, in the savings and loan debacle, and take them on. And Joe Selby was a Texan, and Joe Selby was gay, and knew exactly what would happen to him. And so he was driven from office with a Speaker of the House, a Democrat, demanding that he be fired because he was gay. Now, obviously, that was just an excuse to get rid of him. And I was one of 4 people that met with the 5 U.S. senators, became known as the Keating Five, where they tried to hammer us to give in to the worst fraud in the nation, Charles Keating. And we didn't just unanimously say no. I worked with these other 3 folks for years. To this day, I have no idea what their political affiliation was or is. It simply didn't matter. So the United States has hundreds of thousands of people who are willing to, we have more whistleblowers than any nation in the world. It's not close. And all significant whistleblowers are retaliated against, 100%. As you know, Patrick, 2 of my colleagues, Richard and Michael, remain unemployable today in finance anywhere in America because they blew the whistle. But here's the thing I've learned from all of these whistleblowers. Knowing what they know now, what a terrible price they paid, they would all unhesitatingly do it again. So there is no ultimate victory where we can just all go home and such. As Yanis says, it's a constant struggle. We are better positioned than most nations to have people who would be willing to sacrifice in that struggle. And I will end simply with the joke, the standard joke. If the head of the European Union had his 4 worst enemies in the room, but only 3 bullets, what would he have done? And the answer is he would have pumped all 3 of them into Yanis to make sure he was dead.
Well, look, one thing I've learned from you from the very beginning of this extraordinary odyssey for us and our team, Bill, is that it's not necessary to hope to persevere. And Yanis, I am so grateful for your time in this. I hope we can do this again at some point if it makes sense for you. But I want to finish with this for our audience. Guys, if you're not aware of this, unfortunately, as global and as immediate and as probably end of the world of the line that we're all dealing with these financial questions, obviously, the climate is another scenario and connected to this as well. All of our policies and everything else, and I've heard you, Yanis, discuss about the leverage in the fossil fuel markets, particularly in Western Europe, which is tied into this as well. But I just want to just give this as kind of a closing thought. Look, the way I've interpreted this, based on Bill showing me the light, is that corruption births and fuels ultimately what my biggest enemy is, fascism. And a system that I interpret, based on all of these perverse ways that we don't understand just the basics of the principles of those things that are our foundation in democracy and the law, and particularly in the integrity of all, is this nature that, what these guys have described to me, based on what I've seen for 13 years, is it's corporate fascism. Sorry if that sounds redundant. It's meant to. but undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism, I hate to admit, through the Federal Reserve, to maintain this mob-like culture of this mafiocracy that is now fueling fascism. So if we don't rise together, if we don't combine, I would encourage everybody to find DM25 in Yanis and everything that he's done. And I know it's probably putting a pause on, but we've got to find a global answer to this corruption that has seeming control over all of us. And that's all I have to say.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you very much for putting us together. And yes, by all means, let's do it again. Once we give the audience a chance to take a breather and digest all this.
Thank you to you both. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Yanis.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank
Your
you.
friendship is a very important source of strength.